suddenly realized the characteristics of what language I want is really a kind of a
Hello, good evening. We're going to get started here. Welcome to our Churchill Club members and guests. My name is Karen Tucker. I am the Churchill Club's Chief Executive and Board Member. Happy to welcome you to our first program of the new year. SRI is generously hosting and sponsoring our program tonight, and so would you please join me in thanking SRI. Our program is called What's Next with the Internet? Vint Cerf looks ahead, and we are honored to have with us the legendary Vint Cerf, Internet pioneer, now VP and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, together with Jessica Vascellaro, who is a tech reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Also like to give a special nod to Carl Hewitt, who was instrumental in bringing Vint to us tonight. Quickly about... If it all goes wrong, it's Carl's fault. So quickly about our next set of programs. Next Tuesday morning, January 12, we present Carlos Ghosn. Carlos Ghosn is the CEO of two of the world's largest automakers, Nissan and Renault. And he is very much throwing his company's future and his own professional reputation around electric vehicles. Should be a fascinating conversation with Ray Lane, who is formerly the president of Oracle and now, of course, venture capitalist at Kleiner Perkins. Then 2 days later, it's Journalism After Print, also a breakfast program, and that features speakers from Google, Outsell, TechDirt, and also a very well-known and respected freelance journalist, and that conversation is with Sam Whitmore. Should also be an interesting program. And then finally on Wednesday, February 17, we present Netflix CEO Reed Hastings in conversation with the former CEO of the Walt Disney Company, Michael Eisner, of course, that is, and they're going to be talking about the future of personal entertainment. And I also wanted to mention that 2010 is the club's 25th anniversary year. And as part of the festivities, we're asking our members and friends to think about some of the recollections that you have, aha moments or wonderful things that you heard on the Churchill Club stage over the years, and to take the time to write those down and send them to us. I mean, you can send them to me directly, and my email address is ktucker@churchillclub.org. Now, our moderator, Jessica Vascellaro, is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She joined the paper in 2005, and she is responsible for the paper's news and feature coverage of Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and other internet startups. She moved to San Francisco. Well, let's say instead of other ones, internet startups then, Carl. She moved to San Francisco from New York about a year and a half ago and has, I guess, traded in her winter boots for being able to run, and she has taken up kite surfing and other Bay Area pursuits, and since coming out here, she has broken a number of major news stories, including the appointment of Carol Bartz as Yahoo's CEO and the Justice Department's investigation into the Google Books settlement. She is a regular guest on NPR and NBC's local tech show, Press Here. Jessica, we look forward to your conversation with Vint tonight, and the microphone is yours. Let's welcome Jessica.
Well, very excited to be here. Vint really doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who don't know, Vint figured out how to get computers to talk to each other, and the rest is history with the internet. But you know, in the past years, even, I think it's become so obvious to us that the internet isn't about communication anymore. It's a software platform, and it's the basis of what gets all of us excited. And from the beginning, when, you know, decades ago, when Vint was working on this technology to now, people continue to look to him for inspiration about what lies ahead. And when I was telling someone I was speaking here, and he was saying he was sorry he couldn't make it because Vint was clearly the most quoted person in digital agency sell decks. So even marketers who are trying to get business and show that they're ahead of the curve are quoting Vint, of course, along with every other technologist who wants to know what he's saying. So we're going to ask him to look into his crystal ball today. And
that's very appropriate considering the temperature in Washington, D.C., which is where I came from. You know, I brought my crystal balls with me.
Now, my next joke, which was, well, now I'll say it, but I was going to make a joke about the future looking, to use a bad internet pun, cloudy with the cloud computing, but you've beat me to that. So let's just dig in, and of course we'll talk about many of the tech trends, hopefully touch the policy issues, and then hand it over to you guys. I would love to start with mobile, because I think it's on everyone's mind, and I'm lugging a new Nexus around that I'm testing.
I'm glad to hear that.
30 days. And
what do you mean lugging? This is a fairly lightweight piece of equipment.
133 grams, which is 3 grams lighter than the iPhone, so 130 milligrams. But, or grams. Anyway, how are we going to be using our phones in 5 years, these super phones?
Well, actually, first of all, it's a little hard to tell, isn't it? Because these are open platforms. And the whole point of an open platform is to allow people to invent new applications and make it easy for people to download and use them. So it's almost impossible to make really good predictions, but let me make a few anyway. One obvious one is that I just realized this microphone doesn't quite go when I turn my head, so I'm going to turn my whole body. All right. So one of the things that you can easily predict is that more and more appliances of all kinds will be part of the internet environment, whether it's home appliances, you know, the refrigerators and ovens and so on, or things in the office equipment, which is already starting to happen, right? The projection systems and printers and so on are part of the internet. The reason that that's relevant to a mobile is that once you put all these appliances up on the net, whether it's a private local network just in your house or one which does interconnect with the public internet, in which case access controls and so on are very important. But once you do that, the mobile is potentially the remote controller for all of these things. Or it becomes a means by which you can reach an intermediary that's up on the net that offers to manage your equipment and appliances and maybe your entertainment for you. So this mobile now replaces all those damn little remotes that are sitting there on the table in front of you. If you're like me, you know, you fumble around to figure out which is the right one to use right now, and that's the one with the dead battery. So in most of the mobiles, you have to keep charged up because they do so many things for you anyway. So you get rid of that problem. You get rid of all these damn little gadgets who have too many buttons on them anyway, and you wind up with something that has a nice, simple web-like interface to it. And maybe you even get some help from an intermediate party who's offering you services to manage those devices. So that's absolutely predictable.
Are there any companies that are taking steps
that are already
direction?
starting to do that? I actually don't know if there are. And if Google were doing that, I couldn't tell you anyway. So, but I don't know.
Google does have there's the power meter.
Well, the power meter thing is a different kind of thing. I mean, the power meter is sitting there, it's a physical piece of equipment and a piece of software. But you could easily imagine using your mobile to get access to the information that you want to know about how am I using electricity, or how do I want to change the profile of my use of electricity in as you get to peak loads and maybe peak load pricing and things like that. So if you're willing to not have the water heater heating, you know, during the peak load, that's cool. You save money, and it keeps the power company from having to build capacity that it doesn't really need more than 2% of the time. So the mobile now becomes the remote control, for one thing. Apart from that, I think you're also going, I hope anyway, by 5 years' time, that there will be internet capability in most automobiles. or at least new ones anyhow. The mobile might actually help us get there, because you could easily imagine having a car with a local network which doesn't yet happen to have internet capability, except when you get into the car with your mobile, you suddenly become the router that connects the car to the rest of the internet. There's one particular circumstance where this would be wonderfully useful. Have you ever been caught in a traffic jam where you can't see where the end of it is, and the other cars on the other side are whizzing by? Every one of the drivers in that car knows the answer to the question you have, which is, when does this thing end? And you'd like to be able to get the answer to that. This way you get that capability. They should be tweeting at you, right, to tell you what the answer is. So I'm anticipating those sorts of things happening. Then there's one other interesting possibility. The current Android operating system has allowed a lot of interesting experimentation to go on. And one of the experiments that I've been doing, not for Google, but for NASA, is to see whether we could put the interplanetary protocols on top of the Android operating system. And it's not because I want you to be able to call Mars with your mobile. That's not the point. The interplanetary protocols are extremely robust in fairly hostile conditions. The Defense Department has tested these things in tactical military communications, and they've worked extremely well. So what I'm anticipating is that if this works in the mobile environment, civilian mobile environment, that we might see that suite of protocols, in addition to the ones we're currently using today, become a part of the normal protocol complement. And if that's true, then you'll be able to have interactions that would ordinarily not work very well, because TCP breaks if the connectivity breaks and you don't have end-to-end communication, but the DTN protocols are much more robust in that regard. There's even some work going on now Cisco, as you may know, launched a router on Intelsat 14. So we now have packet capability on Intelsat 14 in space, and one next possibility is to put the DTN protocols on that satellite. So at some point, you might see, 5 years from now, the ability to use these protocols through satellites from your mobiles. So that's another possibility.
Rewind a bit to talking a bit about the protocols,
okay.
and because they struck, I had to do a lot of Wikipediaing to get some of that stuff. But it sounds very exciting. But just talk about your work there in developing those, and what, why you developed them, where they are.
Why would you do interplanetary anything?
Exactly.
Right? Well,
yeah.
Some people, of course, think, oh, you're building this interplanetary network, and then you're hoping somebody will come. No, that's not what's going on. The short story is that almost all of our interplanetary work, our being the U.S. and the rest of the world, involves point-to-point radio links to communicate with the spacecraft back to Earth. There's something called the Deep Space Network, which the Jet Propulsion Laboratory runs, which has 3 big 70-meter antennas that are stationed about 120 degrees apart on the Earth at Madrid, Spain, Canberra, Australia, and Goldstone, California. So no matter how the Earth rotates, those big antennas can see out into the solar system. But most of the applications have been point-to-point radio links. Well, that's a very constrained kind of network. One link, maybe a radio relay, but that's about it. If we had richer communication protocols, store and forward packet switch protocols for these systems, we could build much more complex missions that involve multiple spacecraft, maybe multiple orbiters, maybe multiple sensor systems on the surface, like the 2 rovers that are running around on Mars. So my colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and now the other laboratories of NASA, have been finalizing the design of these interplanetary protocols to be used by all of the spacefaring nations. And our motivation is very simple. It's an open source, open system. Anyone who wants to use it is free to. And if they start using these protocols as standards, then anyone's spacecraft will be able to communicate with anyone else's spacecraft. When you complete the primary mission, these spacecraft often survive well beyond that. And so they can be repurposed as part of a communication system. And so what I'm anticipating, assuming this all works right, is that as we launch new missions to different planets in the solar system, the previous missions will become, mission assets will become part of an interplanetary backbone. So I am guessing that over the course of the next several decades, we will actually accrete over time an interplanetary system. That'll be wonderful and useful for both manned and robotic exploration. So, it sounds like science fiction, but it's engineering.
does it make YouTube faster here? I mean, are there applications or uses for it that are terrestrial?
Well, the terrestrial applications are the ones that don't work very well when you have very hostile environments, interference, loss of connectivity. The interplanetary protocols anticipate that. And it's pretty obvious why. I mean, think about trying to talk to a rover on the surface of Mars. Mars is rotating. We haven't figured out how to stop that. So you can't talk to it when it's on the wrong side of the planet. But if I had an orbiter that I could pick up, then I could transmit data to the orbiter, and the orbiter could transmit data to the rovers, which, by the way, is how it works now. It's been reprogrammed to run in store and forward style instead of point-to-point mode. So we're getting 99.9% of all the data that we're expecting to get back from Mars is coming back through a store and forward network. It's only 2 hops, but it's it's sort of the primitive. Well, the ARPANET was only 4 nodes, right? So we're at the stage now where we were 40 years ago in terms of space internetworking. But hell, I wish I was 8 years old because I'd like to see how this turns out about 50 or 60 years from now.
Another trend we can't hear enough about these days is cloud computing and tying into just all this connectivity we have. And what's next? I mean, I think most people here have sort of agreed that there's massive efficiencies to be had with cloud computing. Google can't stop talking about it. But I mean, what is next? And I know we talked a little bit about cloud exchanges, and I thought that was interesting.
Well, in fact, interestingly enough, there's a guy who used to work here at SRI International. His name was Dan Lynch. Dan Lynch started and ran and then sold a company called Interop. Some of you will remember that. It was a wonderful exhibition of Internet capability, and it was part of the whole story of commercializing Internet equipment, technology, and services. Well, Dan convened a meeting here at SRI in this room about 6 months ago and brought us together to talk about interconnecting clouds of computing systems together. Well, this is a really interesting concept, right? Because there are different companies making clouds. We make clouds at Google, Microsoft makes clouds, Amazon makes clouds, IBM makes enterprise clouds. There are lots of these different systems. They're all kind of different. They aren't all the same, but they have the same character. Lots and lots of machines all working together trying to solve problems for people who are remotely accessing them. At some point, it makes sense for somebody to say, I want to move my data from cloud A to cloud B. And the first problem is that no cloud knows about any other cloud. It doesn't know even how to say move it from cloud A to cloud B. That's like the internet problem. Because in 1973, when Bob Kahn came to Stanford and said, hey, we have this problem, there wasn't any way for the networks of the day to speak about another network. They had no vocabulary for that. And even if they could refer to another network, they didn't know exactly what the other network would do for them. Well, the cloud situation is exactly like that. We don't have any inter-cloud standards. So anybody who's looking for a dissertation topic, this is a good time to do it because we're at the same point now in 2010 with intercloud as we were in 73 with internet. So people are going to want to move data around. They're going to want to ask clouds to do things for them. They may even want to ask 2 clouds or more than 2 clouds to interact with each other in order to take advantage of the computing power that those clouds have. So there's a whole raft of research work still to be done and protocols to be designed and standards to be adopted that will allow people to manage assets in multiple clouds and for clouds to interact with each other. Google is very, I think, much resonant with this notion. One of the things we commit to is data liberation. That is to say, if you have data in the Google cloud, you should be able to get it out and move it wherever else you want to go. We have the ability to let you pull the data out, but we don't necessarily have the ability for you to say to us, send it over there. So this comes back now to mobiles for just a second. One of the nice things about clouds is that it has variable capacity, and it's fairly natural to apply more computational capability if it's necessary for a while, and then once you complete the task, you can reallocate those resources to others. This is my friends in the cloud world don't like it when I say this, but this is kind of like time sharing on steroids, right? Because time sharing was the same idea. You dynamically allocate the assets of the time shared machine, and when somebody doesn't need it, somebody else gets those assets. And it's, of course, an interesting problem to do that efficiently and effectively. Clouds are like that. So the notion of a mobile as a kind of cloudlet is interesting. So if it has the same protocols that the clouds do for interacting with each other, it will be like the internet. The internet doesn't care that one guy is a microprocessor and somebody else is a supercomputer. From the standpoint of the protocols, everybody is equal. So I think that mobile should be cloudlets in some sense. They should be able to interact with clouds the way any other cloud would interact with you. It's just that, well, it has a finite capacity and it has maybe a little less bandwidth, but from the protocol point of view, it should be sort of equal. That means that a mobile, if it's a cloudlet, can tell these two clouds to go do something together. And so I don't know how long it's going to take to get this all sorted out. In the case of the internet, it took 10 years from 73 to 83 when we finally rolled it out. But it was 5 years to do the basic design and standardize that, and another 5 years to do the implementations in a lot of operating systems. So if we could rely on that as an indicator, maybe the intercloud problem could be solved in 5 years' time. So to come back to your time frame, by 5 years from now, maybe we really will have an intercloud capability, and mobiles can be part of that. So there. All right.
Right. Well, at least, I mean, when it comes to cloud services for developers, I think Amazon's really run away with a lot of the attention and buzz so far. And why is Google just sitting there with that little app engine when Amazon has
what do you mean,
all
little
the,
app engine?
you know, I mean, but okay, we'll talk about app engine. I mean, what the strategy is, because at least for like the startups out here, they're all on Amazon and they don't pay attention to Google.
So first of all, you should consider for a moment what we do with the cloud right now. We run a whole set of applications in the cloud which have been designed and implemented around the cloud architecture and a lot of the underlying systems. We're not running random stuff on that cloud. And everybody is concerned about how secure can this system be? What if you run random code? We're already enough concerned about browsers downloading random JavaScript and then executing it to have gone to build Chrome and release that as what we hope is a more secure environment with sort of sandbox capability to try to minimize the risk factors. So the question about running arbitrary code in the Google Cloud is an open question. It hasn't been proposed, or if it has, it hasn't been adopted as a tactic for us. And I can't tell you that it would become a proposition. It depends a lot on our ability to service all the other applications that people rely on without having the cloud system run out of capacity running arbitrary code. So, we may let other people try that out.
Would it be problematic for Google if, all these internet businesses get built in Microsoft's cloud or Amazon's cloud? Or
I don't think so, and the reason is that I think that ultimately there will be a real demand for enough standardization that you can use anybody's cloud. Now, there might be pressure to run arbitrary code in the Google Cloud. You can't do that today, and I don't know. If that becomes a popular model, and if it makes sense for us to incorporate that into our business model, that might happen. But frankly, our business model doesn't need that right now, as near as I can make out. That's an engineer pretending to be a businessman. You should watch out for that.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Washington, because you are a Washingtonian and been very involved in every sort of internet policy issue down there. And one thing us out in Silicon Valley have been hearing since President Obama started running during his campaign was that this was the first tech administration, and oh my God, these guys get it. And
yeah, they really do.
So tell us, besides the YouTube weekly video addresses and all that stuff that we see, I mean, what really is different? And then maybe we can get some of the policy issues too.
The two people who are the most visible, or three people that are the most visible in this administration who really get the importance and utility of the network and cloud computing and everything else are Anish Chopra, the CTO, and his deputy, Andrew McLaughlin,
who is at Google,
and the CIO, Vivek Kundra, who's CIO in the OMB. And it's a really interesting combination. It's a very powerful combination because Anish and Andrew have policy responsibility, and Vivek has the responsibility for dealing with the president's budget with regard to IT. And if they work together well, the implication of that is that the policy for government agencies is going to be influenced by your ability to get your budget into the president's budget. So if Vivek isn't persuaded that the proposal that has to go into the president's budget is appropriate, and he's going to be getting a lot of input from Anish and Andrew, then it's going to be hard for an agency to steer away from what the president wants to happen or what Anish and Andrew would like to have happen. So that's a very powerful grouping of people. The other thing I would observe is that there are a number of people, young people from my point of view anyway, in the administration now who really have grown up in this environment and appreciate the horsepower that you can get out of information technology and the potential efficiencies that you get out of it. So one thing I hope you've all noticed is that Vivek has pushed really hard to get agencies in the U.S. government to expose information which should be available to the American public. After all, our taxes paid for it. People like Carl Malamud, whom I'm sure many of you know, is another great proponent of trying to unlock information that's held in the administration that should be available to the public. And so efforts are underway to make that happen. And I think Vivek has also made it very clear that he wants to do the same thing that he did in the D.C., Washington, D.C. district as the CIO. He wants the U.S. government to start using cloud-based computing techniques in order to not only be more efficient, but also to enhance the ability of agencies to collaborate with each other. If you look at cloud-based applications, the fact that you're sharing common content in the cloud is a very powerful collaboration tool. And if anybody's paid any attention to some of the recent problems that have shown up in the intelligence community, you'll notice that collaboration turns out to be a very important part of it. Sharing of information is an important part of it. And cloud computing has this nice characteristic that there's never any question about what's the latest version of something. It's the version that's in the cloud, as opposed to who has the copy on their laptop or their desktop that's the current version. So there's a lot of mechanism in the cloud world that will facilitate collaborative sharing of information. And I'm pretty sure that the guys in the current administration do get that.
What about, so out of Washington, we're hearing a lot of talk about tighter privacy regulations these days. And people at the FTC have gone as far to say that they think that there should be some more regulation and we shouldn't let internet companies self-regulate. What do you think what do you think they should do, and what do you think will happen in the coming months?
So first of all, there's no question in my mind that privacy is at the top of many people's thoughts. More and more information about us seems to be in digital form in various and sundry places. And I think a lot of us care a great deal about that. I can tell you Google cares a lot about that because we recognize that our products and services are dependent on people's willingness to trust us with their information. Your email is in our servers. Your documents are in our servers. Your spreadsheets are in our servers. Not only do you not want us to accidentally release them, but you also don't want user A shouldn't be seeing user B's stuff. So we're very conscious of the need to build the system to provide those protections. On the other hand, I have to tell you, as an American, I look at our behavior patterns, and I look at my own, and I'm embarrassed because I have credit cards. And at the end of the year, I get this report from American Express saying, which hotels I was at, which airplane rides I took, and what else I bought, in date and time and everything. I can throw my diary away because the credit card company knows everything about me. And so I look at that, and I say, holy cow. And then I say, well, would I stop using my credit card? The answer is no. And why is that? Because it's so convenient. I don't have to worry about changing money and everything else. They handle all those transactions all around the world. And so for some reason, I just put up with it because it's so convenient. So Americans, anyway, have traded convenience, privacy and convenience have been traded off. Now, to be fair about this, mistakes and accidents, not necessarily deliberate things, but mistakes and accidents. I left my computer, in the car, or I dropped my memory stick, and it just happened to have 760,000 Social Security numbers in it with other information. We mess up. And that's not because somebody is evil is out there doing something. It's just because we do dumb things. And so one question is, can we help build technologies that will make it less likely that when we do something dumb, we will also spill information? There's an opportunity for some serious development and research work to improve our ability to secure things.
Is that just better and better encryption?
People tend to imagine that privacy and security are affected simply by having more crypto. And we all should understand that crypto is a part of the story, but it is not the whole story by any stretch of the imagination. Lots and lots of bad things can happen. And there is the inverse problem of that. My disk is encrypted. Somehow the password got corrupted, and I couldn't remember what it was. Well, so we have a problem, right? And eventually we were able to work our way through all that. But I have to tell you that trying to secure things and keeping things private and protecting everything has its side effects. And so the real problem and the real challenge is to figure out how to design and implement systems that are easy to use and still provide adequate security. SSL, for example, or TLS, is a good example of that. You don't notice it because you're not asked to provide anything. It's just an exchange of keys. The keys get generated on the fly, and you build an encrypted tunnel between the source and sink. You don't notice that, but it's protecting your privacy, except for one thing. It protects the data as it's going through the tunnel, but what if the machine that the data lands on is open? So, that's a separate technical problem. Privacy is also a policy problem. So let me rattle on here for one moment. I used to work for a company called MCI, and they knew everything about their customers' calling patterns. They knew what numbers they called, they knew when they called the numbers, they knew how long they talked. We treated that information as private information. As a business practice, we treated it as private information. We had to decide to do that. It was important to us that we decided to do that. That doesn't mean that we didn't screw up. There were times, I don't know of any, but there may have been times when that information got released. But the business policy was just important as the technology.
What happens when the government calls, though?
So, well, I'm sorry?
What happens when the government calls MCI and says...
So, well, now we get into this interesting tension between privacy of individuals and the security of the society. And there have been books written about this tension. I remember at least one called Limits to Privacy. The book was about the tension between protecting people's privacy and protecting the society from people who wanted to do harm. And the question is, what's the balance? And we're a nation of laws, theoretically, and we're supposed to follow the law. So if the law says that under certain conditions you have to divulge that information, unless you choose to break the law, you have to divulge it. But in the meantime, you should be protecting it, except under those specific circumstances. Now, you started out by saying the government is worried about privacy and might want to introduce more regulatory constraint with regard to protection of privacy. I think that's not an unreasonable thing for the government to try to do. Look at HIPAA, for example, in healthcare. There is, however, a big problem, and I'll shut up on this point after this one more point to make. I've been watching the standards development effort for healthcare, and I can tell you it's become extremely complex and messy and aggregated because security has permeated all of the protocol architecture. And the problem with allowing everything to get affected by that is that it gets so complex that you're not clear whether after you implement it all, it actually does what it's supposed to do. And so there needs to be some clarity and some simplification and in the design and architecture of systems like that so that you can actually implement them in a way that you can convince yourself works. And there's work to be done there for HIPAA, for the healthcare, for financial transaction records, and for even the smart grid program has a security element to it because you don't want some 15-year-old to take over the control of the power generation and distribution system. So all of those systems require some very care in the reference architecture and the protocol architecture, and right now there's still work to be done.
What role is Google playing in this work? I mean, all these issues are at the heart of its business.
Well, Google has a specific interest in the smart grid. I have a personal interest in this, quite apart from my Google role, because I spend a lot of time with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology on their Visitors Committee for Advanced Technology, overseeing the activities of NIST. And 3 of the activities are lodged in the Information Technology Laboratory, specifically for healthcare IT standards, for the smart grid standards, and generally for cybersecurity. So I have a personal interest in trying to participate in sorting through the architectures and the designs of those things. And Google, of course, is going to care a great deal about that because ultimately we want our systems to be consonant with and able to support whatever those security techniques are.
When Google starts to get involved in standard setting these days, or they're such a target with their growth that it seems like people are so suspicious of them. And so how does the company, has the company had to rethink how it advocates for certain things and how vocally it does things? Because,
Well, we try very hard to work in the open standards forum according to the open standards rules. And so as an example, in the Internet Engineering Task Force, I've always thought that you checked your guns at the door, that you are not representing a company, you're representing technical expertise. And we play that game by those rules. So we do have people who show up at the various standards making activities, but we try to do that in an absolutely technical way which is intended to benefit everybody. That's why we spend so much time with open standards and we spend time with open source as part of our policy. So I can't do anything about people who are suspicious of Google. They will be suspicious, and the only thing I can think of that might be helpful is that there's a lot of conspiracy theories, and I've been thinking maybe we should just have a conspiracy theory page which we will put up the latest conspiracy that we're working on, so people don't have to invent them. We'll just say, okay, so this is our conspiracy of the week.
With an FAQ, right?
Right, or pick one from A, B, and C, and with 2 you get egg roll or something. So the whole idea here is to be as open and transparent as possible about our standards making work. We know that we benefit, and we know others do, from having open standards, really.
What do you think will happen around the net neutrality debate? We have these now, some actual guidelines that FCC's put out, but where's this headed?
Well, you know that the FCC under the previous administration did try to incorporate 4 openness rules into their rhetoric, and we've been advocating a few more, one of which has to do with avoiding anti-competitive action. Just because you happen to control a broadband access resource should not empower you to interfere with someone else who wants to compete with a higher level application. So, if you're a company that's offering video services because you're a cable company, and you are also providing broadband internet service, it should be the case that you are not allowed to interfere with someone else's ability to deliver video service through the broadband channel just because you happen to make a business of that. And of course, sometimes there's a reaction of the form, we own this system and you shouldn't interfere. The trouble is there isn't very much competition in the broadband market, and at best there's 2 competitors with the same substitutable services. And the consequence of that is that that's not a market that is disciplined by competition. And in the absence of competitive discipline, you need to have regulatory discipline. My view right now is that there's nothing stopping anyone who's offering those broadband services from also offering value-added services. They should be able to compete in the marketplace just like everybody else. My view, and I think Google's position, is that they simply shouldn't be able to abuse their access to and control over the broadband channel to prevent other people from offering those same services to their subscribers. And if we get to that point where it's understood that it's just the competitive thing that's the issue, that doesn't mean that you can't charge more for more usage. It doesn't mean that you can't offer differential services to deal with low latency. It just means that you can't be anti-competitive in your behavior. I think that's a very reasonable outcome.
Why doesn't Google get into the service business? Why don't some people would say it's getting closer with Gizmo 5, Google Voice, but in the wireless, why, if the service is so important to you guys, why not just offer a great cheap one?
A great cheap wireless service?
Yeah, or broadband service, or
Actually, let's think about this for a second. We did do a little wireless network in Mountain View. I don't know if you know why we did that. It's because, as I understand it, this happened kind of just as I was joining the company. I understood that we were asked by the mayor of San Francisco to try to offer a free Wi-Fi service to the city. And so some engineers got together and said, we don't quite know how to do that, so let's build one and figure out how much it costs. So we built one in Mountain View. Then we went off and we worked with Earthlink to to figure out how we would do that for the city of San Francisco. And if I remember right, we were awarded the right to do that. Then I discovered what that meant was that we got to go and bid this to 29 different jurisdictions around the San Francisco Bay Area. Now we got down to the real issue, which was how much were we going to pay for the light poles, for access to the light poles. And then I don't know what happened in there because this wasn't part of my responsibility, but somehow I don't think that worked out very well. As a business model, it's very hard for me to imagine a global company like Google wanting to invest in infrastructure for the entire world. I mean, you may think that we're, infinitely wealthy, but we're not. And so putting capital into the entire world's communication infrastructure doesn't sound to me, an engineer, like a really good business model. On the other hand, as the chief internet evangelist, I think it's very important for everybody to build their own pieces of internet and connect them together, which is what's kind of been happening. If you look at the way the internet works today, it's hundreds of thousands of networks that are all voluntarily interconnected. So from my point of view, Google should be espousing more internet building, and it should do what it can to help facilitate that. But I don't think that we should be in the business of actually building and operating pieces of internet, except the parts that we have to use for ourselves.
What about white spaces? I mean, I think Google has done a lot of work building out things to help prove the feasibility of that, and just came out and said that they'd be willing to have a database that would keep track of all this information. So it's sort of a fine line.
That particular, first of all, our motivation in the white space is simply to open up more capacity that people could use. Personally, and I think Google corporately, has seen the value of the Wi-Fi world with the unlicensed spectrum, with all the creative new ideas that people have come up with for using radios in that unlicensed band, as long as you stay within the FCC, Part 15 limitations. So I think our view is that the same sort of thing could be quite beneficial in the white spaces regime. And the complaint, of course, is that maybe you'll be radiating in a place where somebody was relying on that particular frequency. So one way to deal with that is sensors. Another way to deal with it is to have a database that says don't do that in this particular area. And the third one is to maybe combine both. So in order to facilitate the possibility of an open, unlicensed white spaces environment, we offered to manage the database. Maybe somebody else will do that. There's a consortium of people that we're trying to figure out how to do that. It doesn't matter to me whether Google does it or somebody else. Somebody needs to do it in order to facilitate the open possibility of an unlicensed white space environment. And I think if we get there, there's going to be lots of opportunities for new products, new businesses, new jobs even.
Where are the other, Google seems to be always trying to grab spectrum somewhere, or not personally, but what are some of the other opportunities? What's after white spaces? I mean, what's next on the chart? Because we're going to run out, right, if we don't find more? Or?
Well, actually, you have to be. First of all, you don't really run out of spectrum. If you talk to any physicist or engineer in the room who knows anything about this, you know that the spectrum just keeps going. The problem is some spectrum is easier to use than others. I mean, let's suppose we were using 60 gigahertz spectrum. This is really great. You get lots of bandwidth at 60 gigahertz. There's only one little problem. It's in the oxygen absorption band, and that means that about after a half a mile, the signal has attenuated to zero, which the CIA likes a lot, right? Because you don't radio. Oh, all right. Oh, sorry. Shouldn't have said that. Some frequencies are useful because of the fact that they die out, which means they can be reused. And so the whole notion of microcells and everything else often is precisely based on the idea that you don't radiate too much. If you look at what Qualcomm has done, for example, in terms of its power control, it's exactly the idea. It tries hard not to transmit at any particular frequency any more loudly than it needs to in order to reach the next hop, but it's trying to not interfere too much with everybody else. So I see frequency reuse as one potential way of getting more utility out of broadband channels. Ultra-wideband is another thing which has come and gone. If the FCC reinstantiates its Technology Advisory Committee, that committee, which I sat on for a few years, was focused on ultra-wideband as an avenue for doing a better job of sharing spectrum. Now, if you're like me and you believe in packet switching, then ultra-wideband is very attractive because it means that you could cohabit. Multiple parties could cohabit in the same ultra-broadband, wideband channels and transmit packets very, very quickly because of the bandwidth. and then get out, stop, and other people can share the capacity. So the whole idea behind packet switching was always sharing of broadband channels. So if we could get to the point where we could credibly build transceivers that are operating at ultra-wideband, we may actually be able to get more people using the same spectrum, because today we tend to narrowly allocate it, and that was to avoid interference. But that's based on technology which is really old. We're at the point now where we have technologies that would allow much more flexible use of broadband channels in packet modes. And so I hope we will see more than just a toe in that water from the FCC, permission to experiment with serious broadband sharing. And if we do that, I think we'll get much better use of the spectrum and more opportunities to try it out.
And who's presumably the other people? Well, in the white spaces world, you've got the TV broadcasters who don't want sharing of, or who are trying to keep the line very delineated.
If I were a TV broadcaster right now, I'd be paranoid or either that or schizophrenic. The schizophrenia comes from the recognition that IPTV can turn out to be so much more flexible than the dedicated transmission of television channel by channel by channel. In fact, you already see the public response. YouTube is an example of that. People like the on-demand nature of YouTube. Packet switched systems can support on-demand a lot more easily than having dedicated channels. On top of which, I think there's this theorem that says there's a finite amount of quality in the universe, and what's happened in the television world is that it keeps dividing, the quality gets divided up into a smaller and smaller number, a larger number of channels with smaller quality per channel. And what I'd love to see happen, frankly, is that we forget the channelized idea and let people pay attention to the content that they want to see, find a way to get that to them when they want it, let them download it and play it back, and make a much more efficient use of that capacity. So,
is Google working on that?
I'm sorry?
Is Google working on that technology? Or
well, Google
Android
is certainly very,
desktop?
look at how hard we work already with YouTube, which is delivering video as a packet stream. And the television companies are starting to recognize that that may be the direction that the video business goes in.
But they're holding, they're just demanding higher fees. Fox, what they did with Time Warner Cable or whatever, they don't seem ready for this version of the universe.
So the interesting question will be, as broadband access becomes available, assuming it doesn't get distorted by non-neutral behaviors, then the general public will be sending messages to the television suppliers saying, this is how we want to get our video entertainment. I'd like to suggest a vocabulary change here. The word television, in my view, is a business model around the medium of video. It's broadcast, it's scheduled, it's programming, and all that stuff. And video is just a medium. And the way people use video today, or trying to use video today, is very different from the scheduled, programmed, everything else. It's time shifting. It's downloading off the net and playing it back on your television set. It's getting DVDs and playing those. In fact, Reed Hastings is an amazing guy, right? He's turned the U.S. Postal Service into a broadband transmission system. It has a little delay, but other than that, it's amazing. I called him up a couple of years ago and I asked him, how many of these DVDs are you putting into the Postal Service every day? And he said, 2 million a day. So I said, okay, let's see, 7.4 gigabytes, 2 million, mobile, 24 hours, 3,600 seconds. It was a pretty respectable bandwidth. It just took 3 days, for it to get there.
Well, now you can, Netflix on demand is,
yeah.
is there.
And it's a very clever business model. Especially the idea that it's a fixed price for some number of things outstanding in the pipeline. It's just, it's really, hats off.
But
so
even Reed's paranoid now because of, the DVD. It's become pretty obsolete. Right?
Well, and you can see the people who supply the DVDs are starting to shift into supplying online as an alternative or an augmentation of that. So I think that it's really inescapable that the media, which had been segregated from each other on separate networks, is inescapably going to find itself combining on the packet mode system. There's a side effect of that. And the side effect is that the distinctions between the media blur. And so telephony and video conferencing and interactive games and programs that do things dynamically all become part of one very interesting, complex mix. So the multimedia, which in the past was mixing of very well-defined media, becomes a much more elaborate and interesting proposition as they all begin to get delivered through this packet mode environment. So I'm actually excited about this mixing and blurring. The internet lets you do that, and I can hardly wait to see what people end up doing with it.
And how are people going to make money in the mixing and blurring world? Ads?
Well, from Google's point of view, the current business model is still advertising. And it's an incredibly powerful business model, partly because it's so targeted compared to pieces of paper which don't change. And they're the same for everybody who looks at it. Everybody who sees an ad from Google sees a different one, depending on what it was they were looking for. And that's a very appealing thing for the advertiser, and it should be appealing for the users to the extent that the ads are relevant. And of course, that's why we care so much about trying to make sure that the ad that you see from us actually is relevant to what we think you're interested in.
Do you think advertising will be enough to support all the type of content that people are going to want? And this is putting my journalist hat on, but you have to indulge
Well,
me.
it's a very interesting question because for some period of time, that's exactly how the television model worked. It was an advertising-based model. The proliferation of channels led to the not necessarily pay-per-view, but for the subscription to buckets. But now subscription is an interesting notion because it is not based on what you're seeing. It's based on the anticipation that you will have things that you want to see in that bundle. And I have to admit to you, as a person who doesn't watch too much television, that when I look at the options, the bundles are becoming less and less attractive. Mm-hmm. And so now the interesting question is whether advertising and the original broadcast model is enough. I actually think that the end result will be a mixture of these things because pay-per-view is something that people are willing to do. They pay for the DVDs, they buy them, or they rent them, or they get them from Netflix, or they can download and play them back on the net. But people have been shown to pay for entertainment that they want. Really? So, but I also think that the advertising model works just fine for at least some classes of the entertainment stuff.
What are give us a couple technologies that we haven't talked about that just get you really excited. What don't we know about that we need to know that's going to be big?
Oh, well, actually, this is a particularly interesting audience. Somebody gave me an interesting statistic and said there were more PhDs within 50 miles of San Francisco than any place else in the world. And probably a lot of them are here in this room. So the chances are very good that anything I said was interesting they already know about. But I will tell you that I have become very excited about optical switching as an efficient way of moving huge quantities of information back and forth. The optical switches have this wonderful property. You're switching lambdas, wavelengths, right? And the fact that it's just the wavelength that's switching means that the guys on the ends can decide what data rate is being impressed on that wavelength. The switch itself hasn't any idea what the data rate is, so I don't have to change the switching technology when I change the data rates that are on that optical channel. So that's very attractive because you make an investment in optical switching and it works for a fairly long period of time independent of how you're modulating that optical signal. So I actually get very excited about that.
And where's that technology in terms of development?
It's at the point now where it is increasingly implementable. I mean, things like MPLS and label switching and things of that kind together with lambda switching are reaching the point where it's technically and economically attractive. So my guess is that when we look at the really high-speed networks of the future, a lot of them will have cores that are optically switched. And then it's only at the edges where you demux into packets and then worry about getting things exactly to the right spot. I think this is going to be, it will save the scary problem of the demand for increasing amounts of capacity in the core of the net.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Great. Well, I think maybe
okay. Here's one other.
Okay,
one more. For you astronomers who probably know more about this than I do, I'm sure. I understand that there's at least one telescope which is being built that has a 3 gigapixel CCD array. And it's capable, I guess, of gathering, I did the math, and I can't remember what the numbers are now, but we were looking at hundreds of terabytes of data per night coming out of this thing. And so one of the big issues that I see that gets me very excited is that we're seeing scientific instruments that are capable of generating just ungodly amounts of information. It's like the Large Hadron Collider, assuming it doesn't blow itself up again, is going to be producing quads worth of data every time they do an experiment. I got to go down and look at one of the detectors. There's something really eerie about this. You get down into this tunnel, and you see something that must weigh hundreds of tons to look at something that's 10 to the minus 13th centimeters in size. And your first reaction is, it took all that crap to look at that tiny little thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that blew me away is that the number of interactions per second of the counter-rotating beams, 25 million interactions per second. In other words, the beams intersect at this one detector 25 million times per second, which means you only have 40 nanoseconds to figure out what the hell just happened. And so they have hardware which is detecting the energy levels. The things spray out in all directions. So you have to have sensors in all directions that pick up the signal and figure out which of those things happening in that 40 nanosecond interval are of interest, because you can't record all of it. So you record just as much of it as looks like it's interesting, and then it kind of propagates its way out into the other detector systems until finally some software can take over and store away what looks like it was important. But when I look at what those guys do, it is just mind-boggling. So, and I can hardly wait to hear what comes out, because if this Higgs boson finally shows up, at least we might have some idea, where the hell does mass come from? It's so fundamental. Things have mass. Why? We don't know. In fact, I don't know if the rest of you have the same feeling I do. 100 years ago, we all thought, well, it wasn't us, but it was our predecessors, that, well, I don't know, all thought we understood the nature of the universe, because the Newtonian universe was very well defined. We had equations that worked. We could make predictions. And everybody thought that all we were going to do is get the constants measured with higher and higher accuracy. And that was all we needed to do, right? And then in 1905, Einstein comes along and blows up the whole thing. And then a few years later, the quantum guys come along and blow up Einstein. And then a few years later, the string guys blow up the quantum guys. And now here we are. There's dark energy and dark matter. We don't know what it is, but it constitutes 95% of the universe. So in 2010, we know less about the universe percentage-wise than we did 100 years ago. So, here we are. We know about 5% of the universe. This is why I keep on learning less and less about more and more until I know practically nothing about any of them. This is astonishing. So it's the nature of science, I guess, that if you think you know a lot, just wait till tomorrow.
Yeah. Hopefully someone will come along and illuminate it, so we think we know 90% until we know nothing
Right,
again.
and we guessed wrong.
Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
So questions?
Well, thank you. Well, I was going to turn it over to everyone else.
Okay, so let me explain what we're going to do next. I'm hearing impaired, okay? So what that means is that in order for me to understand your question, sometimes I have to run around like Geraldo in case I have to lip read. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to run around with my little microphone, and my friend Carl has the first question. So Carl, what's your question?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Vint. Our industry has been enormously successful in a very short period of time. And we've reached the point now where we're just about to become even more successful. For example, there's my friend here, the smartphone, right? I can't live without it. It's with me all the time, and it's about to become even more valuable. It knows more about me than my family. It knows the kind of food that I like to eat. It knows what I've eaten recently. It pretty much knows whether I'm hungry now or not. So it's got a lot of personal, intimate information about me. Now what happens when this thing has a lot of personal, intimate information about me? What's always, right, always in the past, when that kind of information has gotten outside my brain, it's been regulated. The medical information got regulated. The legal information got regulated. So I think it's going to get regulated too. And it's inevitable. And the question now for Silicon Valley is, do we fight this regulation or do we facilitate this regulation? Now, since we haven't been regulated before, our natural reaction is, hell no. This will stifle innovation. This is coming from those guys back east who know nothing. They can't possibly do a reasonable job of regulating us. So let's just say no. Let's fight the damn thing. But I think we're going to lose. And what's going to, and what's going to be really interesting is there's a certain guy around here who we're going to be watching very carefully as to whether they fight the regulation or they facilitate the regulation.
What's the question, Carl?
And the question is Google going to fight the regulation or facilitate the regulation?
Okay. So, first of all, you're asking a policy question, and although I have some policy responsibilities, that particular question may be above my pay grade. On the other hand, I tell you what I would prefer. I actually believe that the facilitation is the right notion because we do want to protect, each of us cares about that information. We care about its use appropriately, and we don't want it to just get out unnecessarily. However, let me give you a little anecdote that might illustrate the interesting problems and maybe even suggest some answers. Let's suppose that you get very sick in a city you've never been in before, and you're in the emergency room. Now, at that moment, the one thing you want more than anything, if you're still conscious, is that as much information about your medical history is available to the emergency room people right then and now. The last thing you're worried about is privacy. You're worried about getting better. On the other hand, if you're still conscious, you're also thinking, I don't want that particular need to open up my records for the rest of my life to those people who served my need at that time. So you want transient access to that information. Well, this should cause the engineers to think a little bit more about the kinds of security mechanisms that might be implemented, including things that have transient authority. Now, I know you know this stuff inside and out. Kerberos is an example, a ticket granting technique which says it expires after a while. The credit card people figured that out. Your credit cards expire. There's a good reason for that. In case they get lost, they have only a finite amount of time before they're no longer useful. Also, you don't need necessarily to send out certificate revocation lists because with an expiration arrangement, it just expires and you accept whatever risk is during the period when it hasn't expired. So these kinds of scenarios should teach us a little bit about the kinds of solutions that we should be looking for. And regulation doesn't actually solve anything, right? Because it's like passing a law that pi is 3. You know, it's easier to remember, but your tires look really funny. So the fact that you regulate something doesn't guarantee the outcome that the regulation is seeking to accomplish. And so from my point of view, because I think we have some utility in the intent, not in the regulation, but in the intent, then the best thing for us to do tactically is to help figure out how to achieve the intent in a way that actually works, as opposed to having laws passed and regulations invoked, which are hard to and maybe impossible to enforce. So that's where I would come out on that, Carl. Okay, other questions? This nice lady over here. This is part of my health plan, by the way, running around in there.
Hi.
Hi.
How you doing? Thanks for the phone.
You're welcome. I didn't give that to her today, by the way, so don't come after me at the end of this meeting.
No, his boss did. Or there's Pam. I was wondering three quick questions.
Okay.
One, I know Dan. I've known him for 30 years, and I could ask him right now, but I want to get your input. You said you put together. Was he contemplating an internet cloud op or an internet cloud?
No, I don't. Well, I don't know. You know, with Dan, you can never tell.
Yes, sure.
But
Anyways,
I think Dan simply recognized that this problem of interconnecting clouds was so much like the problem of interconnecting networks, and he spent a significant piece of his career promoting the solutions to that problem. He wanted to see and be a part of figuring out if there was a solution to the intercloud problem. And so that's as far as I've gotten in this thing. We're just exploring what the technologies and architectures might be to solve the problem. I don't think we've gotten anywhere to the point where we even know what the answer is, let alone deciding to have an exhibition about it.
And just two quick questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
The other one is broadband. Do you have any insight on policies or infrastructure on how we can increase broadband? I think we're like number 37 in the world in terms of speed and
there's arguments
capacity.
about what the right number is. I don't
Okay.
care what the number is.
Whatever.
All I care about is getting more broadband
Exactly.
out there.
Right.
So, there is this National Broadband Initiative, as you know, and NTIA and the FCC are involved in that. The amount of money that's allocated in the ARA funding is pretty limited. It's $7.2 billion, which I know for you and me, that would be a pretty significant retirement arrangement. On the other hand, it isn't a whole lot of money in order to get fiber everywhere. The Australians, for example, bit the bullet. They decided to break up Telstra into two parts, the last mile part plus the other part, the switching part, and then put $40 billion into getting fiber everywhere in Australia. So they've taken a major leap forward. They are way ahead of everybody else in that regard. Now, of course, we'll see how it all turns out, but the initiative is pretty astounding. We aren't anywhere close to that. What I'm frankly wishing for, I'm not even necessarily hoping for, I'm wishing that our tactics as a country for broadband recognize that the value of broadband is not in creating revenues for the company that generates the broadband or provides the broadband service, but that our national interest is creating new jobs, new opportunities, new applications, and new businesses that work on top of that broadband.
Or making it more efficient.
And then the taxes that we collect from the new businesses and applications and everything else will be far more than the money we would have gotten, for example, from just auctioning the wireless waves. So I would hope to see some of this expenditure designed around building up new businesses. You remember what happened when the Rural Electrification Act was passed in 1934? There were funds available at low interest rates in order to allow small businesses to provide telephony and electricity around the United States, especially in the rural parts of the country, which is where we suffer, especially with regard to deficits in broadband. I would love to see tactics like that, allowing small businesses to build out, or even municipalities to build out broadband facilities and then own and operate them. There is an argument that gets made sometimes that says a municipality shouldn't be allowed to build a broadband facility because it's the government, even if it's local government, competing with the private sector. That's the usual mantra. It strikes me that the more likely scenario is that some municipality decides to tax itself in order to get the capital to build out this thing, and then they hand a contract off to the private sector. And so the people who complain about this are only really complaining that they didn't get the contract.
Yeah, right.
It's not the government competing with the private sector. It's the private sector competing with the private sector. Okay, next question.
Well, it's actually about submarines, and a friend of mine has flying submarines, and it's the world is 2/3 water. 97% of life on Earth is actually in the water, and
Craig Venter would certainly agree with you there.
okay.
But most of it's microscopic. But anyway,
yeah,
that's all
right,
right.
yeah, that's true. But I was just wondering, I thought it would be very interesting for Google to have Google Earth with submarines.
Oh, well, actually, we have Google Ocean.
I know you have Google Ocean.
And Google
but
Ocean was
it's
intended
like
to give
live.
at least the topography of
Right.
the underwater part. Getting the rest of what's in the water, boy, I don't know. The problem is it's not stable. The topography doesn't change too often.
Yeah.
By the way, did everybody feel the earthquake today? That was, there was a little brief moment of, uh-oh. Yeah, fortunately, it was only, 4.1 Richter scale. Oh, well, we're accustomed to those. No big deal.
Yeah.
Anyway, the ocean, the ocean floor doesn't change too quickly, okay? But the ocean fauna and flora change all the time. So
But you have street views, so you could have ocean view.
I'll tell you what, maybe you'd like to talk to Larry and Sergey. They do kooky things like that. Okay, all right. There's one back here. I hope I don't trip all over everybody in the process. There you go. You want to say who you are?
Hi, Bill Sutter with
Hi,
Galaxy
Bill.
Ventures. You've talked a lot tonight about sort of back-end and internet guts issues, and I'm also very interested to hear what your vision is for how the internet user experience and the browsing experience is going to change over, let's say, the next 5, 10, and 20 years.
Okay, well, I don't know if I can go all the way out to 20 years. One interesting thing about the way the internet works now, the World Wide Web part of it anyway, is that we find ourselves increasingly using browsers to get access to information services. And you can see Google's motion in that direction. Our investment in mobiles and the Chrome browser, for example, is indicative of a belief that we've come through a cycle where it's almost like 1960. Remember when we used to have terminals that connected to these big computing systems, and if you looked at the computing utility idea around 1965 was a giant building with smoke coming out the top that had a big computer in it, and everybody got access to it through the telephone network. Well, here we are, it's 2010, and we have these big buildings with smoke coming out, well, steam coming out the top, with a giant number of computers inside, and people getting access to them through a network from a remote device, which might be as simple as a netbook, that's running Chrome OS and Chrome browser and so on. So Google right now is very much oriented in the direction of having people do a lot of their computation using the remote resources of the data centers. I still think in the long run that the devices that we carry around are going to increase in their horsepower, because that's just what Carl was describing, how much is going on in his laptop or in his mobile today. So my guess is that the real story in the end is going to be a mixture of computation that's going on and applications that are going on in devices that we carry around with us, and substantial amounts of computation taking place in the data centers when we can't do it locally. Why might we not be able to do something for ourselves in a local device? Well, one answer might be that the information that's needed isn't there, and there's too much of it, and you wouldn't want to download it into the local device even if you could. That's the case where you want the computation to go to where the data is. Or maybe you need to do something that involves more than one data center or even more than one cloud. You don't want all that to happen in your remote device. You want to do that where the horsepower is and where the high bandwidth networking is. So I am pretty convinced that we are going to make very heavy use, better use than we have in the past, of computing resources that are dynamically allocated. And that's what the browser is doing for us. It's the 2741, for those of you who remember IBM gear, of the 21st century is the browser. Now, what happens after that, I don't know. Ask a 13-year-old, because they're the ones that will figure it out. Yes, sir. Wait, I'm sorry. This is the hard part, isn't it? There you go.
Hi, I'm Sridhar with LightNet.
Hi
I
there.
had a quick question. I remember reading somewhere that you indicated that if you could go back and design something in the IP addressing, that you would have separated the location and the identifier.
Yes, I would. Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Okay, so this is a geek question. And I'm going to go around this way so I get out of everybody's way. When the TCP, well, actually, when TCP was the only protocol, there was TCP and IP later, but TCP was the first one. And so there was really only one identifier, and that was what we would call today the IP address. Then we split IP off from TCP, and we wanted IP to be this very simple kind of electronic postcard thing. And TCP was the thing that disciplined the unruly user datagram protocol, roughly speaking. So at the time when we split the TCP off from the IP protocol, there was some serious thought given to whether we needed another address space, another identifier space for the TCP layer. And I decided against it, thinking I was being incredibly clever and smart. I thought, well, actually, I don't need to have a separate one because the address is already there in the IP packet. So we'll create this pseudo-header thing that binds the TCP connection to the IP protocol, not understanding that things with IP addresses might actually move around. Now, you might say that at the time, the things with IP addresses were great big computers that didn't move around. Moreover, right here at SRI International, we'd already licked the mobility problem. It was called the packet radio network. And we did have things moving around in the network, and it worked just fine with an IP address that was fixed, because the IP address was bound to a packet radio address, and the packet radio address was changing as you moved around, but it was rebound and rebound to the IP address, which is just the same way that roaming works today in the GSM system. Your telephone number tells you nothing about where you are. The telephone number gets bound to a routing identifier. So I thought that we had solved the mobility problem with packet radio. So I ignored this problem. And then, as time goes on and we discover that there are all these damn little devices that move around with us that have IP addresses that need to change because they keep connecting to different places in the internet. Uh-oh, bad design. So if I had to do it all over again, I would have split those things. Now at the time it looked crazy to do it because the header size was huge. Now it doesn't look so silly to do that, and there are protocols like HIP that could achieve that. There are a couple of others as well. Frankly, it's implementable today. We should try that out. We should really do that. Current mobile IP sucks, right? IPv4, mobile IPv4 is terrible, and IPv6 is only slightly better, but HIP or something like that would be a lot more sensible. So, you can't get everything right. I screwed up on the 32-bit address thing, too. There's one way over there. Well, I'll get you next. This lady got her hand up.
Hi. If intercloud standards are 5, maybe 10 years away from being developed, and the government wants to get into openness, transparency, and data sharing, what do you think they should be doing so that they don't develop too quickly and go down the wrong path?
Oh, this is a very interesting question. I had this conversation with Secretary Locke at the Department of Commerce, who quite understandably, on, let's say, the smart grid, was saying, there's $40 billion waiting to be spent of ARA funds related to the smart grid program, and we all recognize that we have to have standards for all these devices that will be part of the smart grid in order to make them interoperable. So there's this tension between getting the architecture right and the protocols and spending $40 billion to make sure that there are new jobs and things like that. So, the response was, you have to have this done in 60 days. And I remember saying to Secretary Locke, Mr. Secretary, I am worried. I understand the motivation to get this done quickly, that you don't want it to take 2 years. On the other hand, what if we get it wrong and we spend $40 billion on something we have to live with for the next 20 or 30 years? That makes me nervous. So the solution to that problem is twofold. The first solution is to be careful what it is that we standardize. And in order to successfully be careful and try not to screw up like I did with the mobility thing, is to have a pretty good reference architecture that tells us what all the pieces are that will be part of this smart grid environment and how they're going to interact with each other. Maybe we can not standardize on some things and standardize now on other things that are going to be relatively stable. Now, I know this is a very generic kind of answer, but it is possible, I think it is possible, to get this, if not exactly right, at least to get it to be the least damaging consequence while we still actually get some of the benefits of standardizing and implementing smart grid. The same argument can be made for security practices, and the argument can be made for the healthcare stuff. But you have to get the reference model right. You have to understand what are the creatures in the zoo, and how are they going to interact with each other, what information do they exchange, what things can they ask each other to do. So there's tension there. You're correct to be aware of that. The people who are responsible for trying to get this to come out are aware of the problem. So they're not being ignorant of it. So unlike, Carl, your characterization of some of the people back east, which would include me since I live there, I think is overdrawn. There are people, especially in this administration, who really do appreciate the subtlety of trying to get this, if not right, at least more right than not. Okay, way over there. Here we go. Heads up. Thank you. Yes, sir. We'll get you too.
Thank you. Thanks. Mike Pickett from
Hi,
Informatica. Love to talk. I'd be curious as we get, as these smartphones get more and more access to more and more information, I'd be curious on your thoughts of we're having access to information and people could seem smart, but they're not really smart. And it's showing up in things like people driving into the mountains with a GPS device and getting stuck. And what do we as a society do to prevent that? Because it's really, that's not helping in terms of creating smarter people.
Okay, so I'll come back. It's just it's easier to do this so I'm not showing my back to everybody. First of all, you know what that reminds me of, Mike? It reminds me of the guy that complained about the invention of writing, because he said people would no longer remember anything because they could just write it down, and so it was a really bad thing, and writing was a terrible idea. It reminds me of people complaining about calculators. People won't be able to do arithmetic anymore because they'll go and use a calculator, and so the society will disintegrate. Now, not to stop making fun of the point, though, it is actually very important for people to recognize that these systems are not always right. In fact, it's also important to recognize that not everything you get off the internet is right. This is called critical thinking, right? You're supposed to think a little bit about the information that you get as opposed to following it, right over the cliff. I do worry that people have a tendency to simply believe what they're getting, even if they know better, because they want to rely on it. It's easier. It's convenient. I guess all I can say is that we need to highlight the mistakes that happen so that people recognize that there's some risk and you should pay attention to what you're doing, as opposed to I turned right because it told me to turn right into this building. Now, the fact that you asked the question suggests that something bad must have happened to you. Did you? There, wait a minute. You got to use the microphone so they'll get this on tape. By the way, everybody understands this is being videotaped.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, so you're on.
No, I have a mother that was a professor in philosophy, and so it is about critical thinking, and I oftentimes experience people that, just as you had said, they believe what they read without going through a critical thinking process, and I don't believe as a society that helps us. I think it puts us into a more precarious situation, and what I am honestly concerned about is what are we doing in the U.S. about education to educate people on critical thinking and knowledge. I mean, just worldly knowledge, not just facts and figures.
Well, in fact, I do agree that if we're going to teach our kids anything, the thing we should teach them is critical thinking. And, amen to that. Look, it's not just the internet that's the problem. It's every source of information. It's newspapers and magazines and radio. Your friends and your parents are sometimes wrong. And teaching kids to understand that that might be the case and to learn how to distinguish good quality information from bad quality information is the best lesson we can teach them. And if we teach them that, then these problems are going to be less a problem. Okay, it's Glenn.
Yes, Glenn from Microsoft. So as the internet has grown by orders and orders of magnitude and is used for things that nobody could have imagined at the beginning it would be used for.
How do you know that we didn't? All right,
I guess I don't.
No, you're right.
Yes.
Okay.
It's amazing to me how little the protocols at the core of the internet have had to change, TCP, IP in particular.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could comment on some of the engineering principles you used at the beginning that you think may have allowed you to develop a protocol that's been so flexible,
so stable,
and so robust for such a long period of time.
Yeah, well, thank you. Actually, there is a very strong principle that drove a lot of this. One of them is don't try to standardize too much. In other words, do as little as you can get away with and have it work. So an example of a principle was that the network itself does not know what the packets are carrying. It has absolutely no idea. It's a bag of bits. And this end-to-end principle meant that when you wanted to add a new application, you didn't have to change any of the implementations of the network itself. Because all the network knew is that it had this little electronic postcard and it had to get it from here to there. But it didn't know what was in it, so it didn't know that it was voice or video or something else. Now, what happens when you make these simplifications is that you allow the network to evolve in ways that you couldn't predict. One of the things, the other reason that the Internet protocol has been so stable is that it didn't know how itself, the IP layer, didn't know how it was being carried. So the packets are not only oblivious to what they're carrying, they're oblivious to how they're being carried, which meant that when a new transmission system came along, as long as you figured out how to get a packet to be carried on that transmission system, it could become part of the internet technology. So the internet kept absorbing new technologies, and that was a very deliberate design decision that Bob Kahn and I made. We said we do not want the IP layer to have any knowledge of the underlying transmission and switching system. You could make an argument that that makes the IP layer less flexible, or not less flexible, but less aware, maybe less efficient. I mean, if it really knew that this was a broadcast channel, or it really knew that this was a radio channel, maybe you would do something different. Or if it really knew it was being carried over an Ethernet channel, maybe you should move the checksum over to someplace else. And some of those things actually came up, and we rejected those and said, no, we want this hiding of information among the layers. We wanted stability at each of the layers so that you could change things inside a layer without affecting a layer above or a layer below. Those were principles that really served us well. And so the one thing that we clearly are having to deal with now is expanding the IP address space so we get to 128 bits of IPv6. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. Well, I used to say that was enough address space so every electron in the universe could have its own web page. And then somebody at MIT, or no, it was Caltech, sent me a note, "Dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there's 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe, and you're off by 50 orders of magnitude." So I don't say that anymore. Okay, I saw a hand just wiggle over here. A lot of them. Let me get this gentleman and that lady over there. Yes, sir. Which way should we go?
My name is Bill Fenwick.
Hi, Bill.
How are you? We've met before.
Yes, we have. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Not sure of that. It was sometime within the last year at Stanford. But my query to you is, I have developed a very strong interest over the last 10 years in the belief that the government is now the major bottleneck in assisting the speed of transactions that will result in economic growth, prosperity, wealth creation, etc. During this period of time, when there has been a lot of discussion with regard to e-government, it seems to me that the roadblock has been the data dictionary for markup languages. And my question to you is, anybody focusing on avoiding that problem so that we can, in fact, get e-government from all the way from the sewer district to the president's office without having to have every layer decide on its or agree with a data dictionary? Right.
Okay, so what Bill is describing is a historically long-term hard problem, and it has a lot to do with ambiguity. I mean, a trivial example of a data dictionary collision is one database uses the word red to refer to the color, and another database uses the word red to refer to a political leaning, and when you try to merge those two databases together, you get really weird results. So the only person that I know about who has spent the last decade taking a whack at that problem is Tim Berners-Lee, who's trying to work out what he has called the semantic web. When I wasn't sure exactly what he meant by semantic web, and I had some fantasies in my head about what that was about, and I cornered him in Madrid, Spain in March this past year and asked him to help me understand a little more deeply what's going on. He now uses the term data linking in lieu of or in addition to semantic web. And what he's basically saying is he wants to have enough descriptive information for data that when you do merges and joins, you can understand what that data means. Now that's a very kind of blasé, bland way of saying what's going on, and there's a semantic question about exactly what it is that how do I describe the data and what does it mean? But I think what Tim is trying to accomplish is building an extensible descriptor of data, and if it's extensible, And if you have data which is different from all the other data, you have to find another way of describing it so its distinguishing characteristics are apparent and the things don't merge inappropriately. The problem is that I don't know how far the implementations have gotten in all this. So the best source of answer for that might be the World Wide Web Consortium or Tim Berners-Lee himself. But I hope he succeeds, because if he doesn't, all the problems that you just described will be with us for a long time to come. This is kind of like trying to figure out what the Dewey Decimal System should be for information. And you will recall several other efforts along these lines that have not necessarily borne fruit. Doug Lenat, for example, with the Psych Project is another example. And the fact that it hasn't worked out means it's hard. And maybe the answer to this question is kind of like the answer to the previous one. Don't try to solve everything. Maybe there are a set of domains in which this is solvable. Why don't we solve that part first and then try to get some useful results out of that before we try to solve the entire problem and boil the ocean in the process. So sorry I don't have a more succinct response, but that's as far as I'm able to go. And we're running out of time. Okay, last question. Where is it? It's over there. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Mason
Hi,
with
Kathleen.
CA, formerly Computer Associates. So cloud computing is the rage, and my question is, how do you secure the cloud efficiently and effectively? And the follow-up to that is, in your intercloud strategy, how would you secure, once you secure the disparate cloud, how
Right.
do you secure this
combination of things.
intercloud?
Okay, so this is like tell me all you know about the universe in 25 words or less. Well, first of all, let me just tell you what the ingredients are, because we don't have time to go into it. Strong authentication is going to be a critical element in the securing of clouds. And the reason that that's important is you have to know what you've got, and you have to be able to validate what you have. So tools for strong authentication are going to be part of the story. Another example of the story, let's suppose that I have information in a cloud. Let's suppose that there's meta information about access control to that. The strong authentication helps me figure out who has access and what actions they're permitted to perform. The metadata helps me figure out under what conditions various parties can have access to the data. Now let's suppose that you want to move your access control data from cloud A to cloud B. And you'd like to have the same access control effectively in cloud B. So what do we do? Well, first question is moving the data itself, and the second one is how do I move the metadata in such a way that cloud B knows how to act on that metadata the same way cloud A did. In order for that to work, we have to have standards that allow the two clouds to exchange the metadata successfully. So the tool that I am using in my head right now for trying to think my way through that problem goes all the way back to 1970. And Carl, you'll appreciate this. When we were doing the Telnet protocols, every computer that was involved in the ARPANET had different kinds of terminals. And we knew if we wanted a terminal on an IBM machine to talk to the servers on a digital equipment machine, we didn't want the digital equipment machine to have to know about the details of the IBM machine, because it uses EBCDIC, and we were using ASCII, and one was Echoplex and one wasn't, etc. So how did we solve the problem? We invented a fiction called the network virtual terminal. And we said, if you're serving terminals that are out on the network, they all will exhibit this network virtual terminal interface. Whatever it is, they will all look like the network virtual terminal. I want a network virtual cloud. I want to define something that all clouds can pretend to be. It won't necessarily allow every cloud to exhibit all of its wonderful features in detail, but it will define what clouds can expect of each other in a standard way. So that's, I mean, conceptually, that's where I'm headed in trying to get this intercloud thing to work in the same nice way that the internet did. Okay, that's all the time I got. That's you're back on the microphone again. Thank you.
Jessica and Vint. Jessica, I just want to thank you for your wonderful line of questioning and for all that you put into this. And Vint, for your humor, integrity, your generosity in sharing your perspectives and reminding us so valuably how lessons from the past can inform and inspire us today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm happy to do it. Thank you very much.
And also a big thanks to SRI and to
Yeah.
all of you for coming. I hope to see you next week. Good night.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thank you so much. That was really well done.